People can hopefully 1 second late. There's rioting. So last week, so apologies for last week, everyone, for the pre-record, which ended up going, rather than being 15 minutes late, ended up being about 47 minutes late, which thanks to YouTube. Never mind. Anyway, hello everyone. We have Edward Leigh here, which is very exciting. And tonight, perhaps confusingly, we're going to be talking about roads. It's a rail natter. We're going to talk about roads. No, we will mention public transport, and this is there's an important context here. Yeah, Edward, how are you? Are you well?
I'm very well, and you too?
Yeah,
busy.
Yeah, well, it's lockdown, isn't it? So we're all in a bit of a weird mixed state that we're probably all right, but actually it's horrible, and we'd like to see our family and friends. There we are.
It's the revenge of the introverts.
This is it. The introverts have absolutely won. They're thriving, whereas anyone who's sort of anything on the spectrum towards extroverted, this is problematic. Yeah, I'll tell you what. Let's do this. Let's go side by side, Edward, so we can see your face properly. There we go. Yeah. So this came about. This whole the suggestion for a road pricing episode actually came about from Dina, who is downstairs with my father-in-law, who suggested this while we were out in the garden, because we were talking about road pricing. We were talking about the fact that the current pricing regime, tax revenue or otherwise, for road traffic, for any private vehicles, but also HGVs, was just inadequate to manage demand in any sort of way, and it wasn't responsive and all these things. And I said, well, there is a thing called road pricing, but I don't really know who could talk about it. And then she said, well, do a rail natter on it and find someone who can. And then here we are. So yeah, that's good. So anyway, without further ado, before I waffle on anymore and destroy our runtime, which I have a habit of doing, let's get started. Let's do this. Let's run the intro. Welcome to Rail Natter, everyone. As the lovely Intercity 225 fades out, and Ed wonders what the hell's going on because he can't actually hear the audio from the intro video. I'm very pleased to say, as I said, Edward Leigh here from Smarter Cambridge Transport, or Smarter Transport Cambridge. The logo is next. I should have thought of that. Ed, yeah, I'll tell you what. Let's do the news first. I've waffled a lot. Ed sat, as ever, our poor guest is sat going, right, I'm sure it's going to start any minute now. I'll just sit here waiting. Let's do the news. Firstly, I don't want to do that. I want to do this. Highly professional outfit. The latest transport usage stats. Yeah, the news. So firstly, I don't know if anyone's been following the trace of transport usage, but I've been trying my best to publish it every time the DFT does and run the traces showing cycling, all road vehicles, bus services excluding TfL, and national rail services. And as it's gone on, I've started to get to know the data set a bit better. And the DFT have been adding these provisional sort of data that always ends up being complete rubbish. So I've started adding that in dotted lines. And then I've included a projection, which is, there's no science to it. Basically, I took the point at which policy had stabilised and then took all those numbers and then put a straight line on it to see kind of probably the earliest that rail usage might return to normal. And already the non-provisional data looks to be kind of diverging from that substantially. So it's really something to measure progress by. But you can see the rise. It's fairly shocking that rail is still less than kind of still hovering around the 40% mark, or less than that. Bus services are improving a bit better, and probably the most depressing lines are the red and green ones. So you can see cycling is essentially returned to normal, which is what you'd expect, given that road traffic has also returned to normal. Yeah, so road traffic is now at 120% on some days of normal, which is not great. Yeah, so there's the transport stats. So you can follow that on that data on Twitter if you're interested in talking about it more. What else do we have in the news? We have yes. Rather sober subject. So my piece is up in Rail Magazine talking about climate change and earthworks. I thought I'd put the Hawkins stripes up because these, as I see it, I don't know, Edward, you might have a different thought on this, but I think this is probably the neatest visualization of the trajectory of average planetary temperatures that I've seen. I mean, it's award-winning. It is good, yeah. There are other uses. I've seen this used in even cleverer ways, but I think in terms of a simple, clear demonstration, this is almost unbeatable. And yeah, so it's in. Where is it? In here for everyone in the corner and see. Yes, so Rail Magazine, worth picking up because there's a lot of good information about the derailment that happened in Stonehaven a couple of weeks ago. So it's worth, if you're interested, if you want to understand more about what happened and why, I'd recommend having a look at that. What else is in the news? Ah, yes, the new Avanti Pride train. This is exciting, and in fact, there's an even more exciting bit of news teasing that I'm going to do at the end of this Rail Natter. But suffice to say, I think this looks awesome. And I'm very excited about it. And it's a full long train, and they've done a really good job of it. And I think it's possibly the jazziest looking train on the network now. All for it. It's very good stuff. And they've used the progress flag too, rather than just the standard 6 stripe. Classic. Anyway, it's good stuff. It's good stuff. But that is the news, and we're here to talk about smarter Cambridge transport and road pricing. Ed, tell us about yourself. Ed, leading smarter Cambridge transport. Let's get your face back up. I've talked far too much. Ed.
So, I got into transport seriously 5 years ago when I set up a group called Smarter Cambridge Transport to be a sort of think tank campaign group in the Cambridge region, because our region was given £500 million by government to invest in transport, which is fantastic. But then when we saw what the local authorities were coming forward with to spend that money on, we were, should we say, underwhelmed, and we thought we could do better. So a group of us got together, we started collecting ideas, researching, structuring them, presenting them, lobbying, and that's been almost a full-time job for the last 5 years. But actually, at the end of 2018, I decided that I actually needed to become a bit more professional. So I took myself off to Leeds University and spent a year studying a master's in transport economics, which was challenging, but very, very, very useful, and really gave me a good understanding about cost-benefit analysis, the strengths and weaknesses of it, how it's misapplied, how it's abused, and how it can be improved. But also just understanding in a much more sort of formal way what transport policy is, and how it all knits together, and to try and get some sort of feeling for how it interfaces with land use and how we analyse all those interfaces. Because in a sense, transport is the glue that ties the economy together. So I spent a year doing that, and now I'm kind of working mostly on trying to set up a public engagement project. Not just around transport, but really developing a local vision in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough for the combined authority for how we live in a sustainable way, zero carbon, in balance with nature, socially just, public health, good public health, mental health, and all the rest of it. Because you can't pick out housing from that. You can't pick out transport from that. They're all
completely intertwined. Yeah.
And so the conversation that we've got to have with the public, and there's no avoiding having the conversation with the public. We can't just expect politicians to just come up with the answer and impose it on the rest of society, or automatically come up with a solution that doesn't require any behaviour change, no adaptation at all. So we've got to bring people along with it, and that means getting them to understand why it's important and what they can do about it, and how they need to be asking politicians for the right thing. So rather than asking politicians for bigger roads, more space to park, cheaper driving, because that's how they live their lives now, and that's what matters to them now. We've got to make it clearer to people that what should matter to them is the health of the planet and their children and their children's children and so on. And that means that we actually have to live in a completely different way. So there seems to be no avoiding having that conversation, but there's no structure through which to have that conversation. So I'm trying to set up a movement to do that in a constructive way. Our paths first crossed. Oh, maybe they didn't first cross at that point, but certainly we first met each other when I was getting a bit annoyed at the Cambridge Autonomous
autonomous metro.
Yes.
This vaporware sort of gadget ban idea that's come out of the... You have to be more sensible about this because you're having to engage with him still, but Mayor Palmer had come up with, without any what appeared to be a slightly strange process in deciding it was the best option. But anyway, we won't go into that too much. But yeah, it was good. We had some interesting conversations at that point. Yes.
Yeah. Your input was really useful, but it's the juggernaut still proceeds, and it becomes ever more difficult to understand how it's all going to knit together. The vision seems to be to use what they call a trackless tram, and there's only one manufacturer in the world of that in China, to run a tram-like service across the whole of South Cambridgeshire, to all sorts of levels on which that's going to be very challenging. And then it will have tunnels under the city of Cambridge in order to get the vehicles in and through the city. So, yeah.
There are a number of layers of... I mean, there were layers that I picked out. There were more layers than I picked. It was just... the whole thing is doolally. But anyway, that's that. So let's press on, shall we? The chat's... It's all kicking off. Everyone's getting upset at the word gammon. And Karen in the chat, which is good fun. Sorry, gammon and Karen are not pejorative terms. It's literally a humorous jab, a part of... I don't know why people are getting upset about this. No one's personally targeting you if gammon is being used. It's just a humorous jab at a part of society that's always had it fine. Apologies if you feel that it's targeting you. Anyway, the chat has gone off on one and they talk about Karens. Anyway, let's leave the chat to it for a little while because that's mild chaos going on over there. In the meantime, let's have a look at this. So, road pricing. Yeah, I mean, I talked about why I was interested in it, but yeah, I suppose the question we're going to start with is why do road pricing? Why do it? So I'll tell you what. Let's have a look at the next slides that you gave me. So there are two reasons here. Talk us through them.
Okay, so there are two fundamental reasons. One is fiscal, and the other is behavioural. So fiscal is really about how the government is going to balance the books as we all shift. We all switch our petrol and diesel cars and stop buying petrol and diesel, and instead buy electricity through the national grid at 5% VAT rather than the huge, about 50% of the cost of petrol is duty and VAT and so on. So there's going to be and in fact, it looks like you can just about see the inflection point in the revenue from fuel duty. That it's peaked and it's now going to start declining.
Interesting. That's already happened. I didn't think it. I thought we were still a little bit of a way off that, but you think that's already, that peak has already appeared.
Well, it's always difficult to call a peak because it could always just be a little flattening off before another rise. But certainly there's been a deceleration in the increase since we came out of the Great Recession. So the government is going, over the next few years, is going to start to feel the pinch. And so therefore it's going to have to come up with an alternative for raising that revenue. And it's not going to, certainly if we have a Conservative government, there's going to be no way they're going to try to recoup that through income tax or any sort of direct tax. It's going to have to come out of some form of replacement, an equivalent tax. So road pricing is really the only practical alternative. And the behavioural one is we need to incentivize people to change their behaviour. We need to make it so that it is easier to choose active or public transport rather than driving. And at the moment, as we'll discuss in a bit, the cost structure is such that once you've invested in a car, really that is always going to be your best mode of transport in terms of being the cheapest and most convenient for almost all trips up, until you're sort of travelling from London to Edinburgh. So we have to change that. That incentive. So we need a different way of charging for driving. Yeah,
and so I suppose there's the element of so a lot of people in the chat are saying that they feel like the current system of gaining revenue from private drivers doesn't necessarily incentivize people who don't use the car very often, maybe use it a few times a year, doesn't incentivize people who drive more responsible vehicles, for example. They feel like, so there's a lot of feeling at the moment, and I certainly share those views. I don't feel like the current system really reflects, it doesn't reward good behaviour essentially in terms of driving it, and it's not so much good behaviour. It doesn't sort of incentivize kind of positive behaviours with relation to emissions reduction and indeed having smaller vehicles are also safer vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll get to some of the detail of why we need behaviour change through looking at the reasons for the fiscal change.
Yeah, shall I give me a nod if you want me to move on to the next thing. So that's why do it. But the next, if I mash this, okay. So we're looking at. So this is talking about money then. So the kind of the money picture, and it's and I suppose some of these kind of graphics, it's not so much directly about money. Money is sort of maybe an allegory for other things going on as well. But yeah, this is quite interesting. I'm glad you've gone into detail on this because it's really fascinating to unpick the numbers. So here's a nice blank white screen. So yeah, I'll bring each of these blips up, and you can kind of talk about them a bit. So the first is the big one, which is fuel duty. So these are incomes from motoring, from tax revenue from motoring. So the first one's fuel duty.
So these are direct payments that people make to the government for, in this case, petrol and diesel.
Yeah. And the next one is the next largest is net VAT. So you've got a breakdown on your that you can give of this. There's obviously a bit more detail underneath that.
Yeah, I mean the net VAT is because businesses don't pay VAT. They can reclaim the VAT, and VAT just sort of passes through businesses. But the VAT is on petrol. In fact, the VAT is added on top of the fuel duty. So there's actually VAT on the duty. There's also VAT on the underlying petrol and diesel. There's also VAT on the manufacturer of cars. There's a VAT on purchasing a car, and there's VAT on all of the services that are associated with cars. So that nets out as about another 9.2 billion.
It's quite a hefty chunk. That that's probably an amount of money that people don't necessarily think of immediately, but actually it's a sizable chunk, and actually it's a larger chunk than the next blob, which is vehicle excise duty. So the thing that everyone calls road tax, but it is not road tax, which is only 6.4 billion a year. That's pennies, really.
Yes, and it's the bit that the government tends to play around with. So over the last decade or so, they've experimented with having zero rating on very low emissions vehicles as a way of incentivizing people to buy low emission vehicles. And then slightly staggering it so that it's more expensive for more polluting vehicles and heavier vehicles. But it's you're right. It's what even the government sometimes in some context refers to it as road tax. Yeah. It is the bit that people are most conscious of because it's you pay it specifically to do with your vehicle, whereas when you're buying fuel, you don't see the duty, you don't see the VAT.
Yeah, it kind of feels with fuel. It feels like, well, I'm burning that fuel, so that's my cost. Whereas the VED feels like, I'm giving that. That's the thing I'm giving.
Yeah,
away.
You're not getting anything in return for it.
Yeah. Which actually plays into slides we've got later on, actually about fixed and marginal costs. But we'll wait for that. Okay, so that's those numbers there. And in fact, there's one tiny little last blip down here. These little circles are to scale because I have. I'm on various spectrums. So this tiny little one here, 0.2 billion, which is the HGV road user levy, which I did know about, but I didn't realise it was that small, considering how large an industry road haulage industry is.
Indeed, and it was added really to try and make overseas HGV vehicles pay their way, if you like. I mean, HGVs cause an enormous amount of damage to the road. I think it's the fourth power. Fourth
power rule. So one HGV does the damage to the road of about 2,000 kind of middle-sized cars. That's about that's a huge. I mean, huge amount of damage, which reflects in money that then has to be spent maintaining roads.
Exactly. So and because HGVs registered abroad they can and they frequently do. They will fuel where it's cheaper in the continent, and then they will drive through the UK. So they're not necessarily contributing their fair share of tax revenue. So hence why the road user levy was set up. But it's a pretty small contribution to the taxpayers, to the Treasury. So, and actually, I haven't seen a recent report of how much it is bringing in. They only reported how much it brought in the first year.
Oh, really?
And then it doesn't appear to be stated in any of the accounts that are broken out into specific sources.
Yeah. Oh dear. We've got a few people who just tried to rub that little dot of mine off the screen. Yeah, it is a tiny little speck, isn't it? It really is an insignificant speck. So that's, I think that, oh yeah, and it's worth noting, and you highlighted this in the information you sent, that's about 7% of the total annual tax receipts. So it's in that kind of order of magnitude, right?
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting. So that's the amount that government takes in from motor traffic on our roads, right? But then how much goes out? It's quite a reasonable question, because that really plays into how important it is for roads to fund themselves possibly. Well, let's have a think about that. So nice blank screen again. So I'll go through these again. So the first is, these are in no particular order, I must add. The national roads expenditure. So that's, I presume that's building, maintaining, anything that goes into. Does that include capital projects?
Yeah. So this is capital and revenue. So it's the building of new roads and the maintenance of them and the lighting and all the rest of it. And it actually varies quite a lot from year to year. So as you remember, Rishi Sunak announced that there was going to be 22.3 or £7 billion worth spent on tarmac over the next 5 years. So that means that actually the expenditure is going to go up quite significantly over the next 5 years. If that's assuming that the Transport Action Network's judicial review doesn't succeed. But if that succeeded, then yes, we might see that money very hopefully being reallocated to where it's really needed.
Absolutely, yeah. So and then local roads expenditure is the same thing. So I suppose that's the primary route network and motorways versus everything else, essentially.
Pretty much. Yeah.
So that's 5.3 billion. So medical and ambulance, 1.8 billion a year. So what exactly is covered by that heading then?
So that is just the direct cost of treating people who are injured in collisions on the road network. So anyway, whether pedestrian or a car driver, that's the estimated direct cost.
Yeah. And then policing is another tiny dot, 0.2 billion a year. So I suppose that's specific dedicated pots of money towards highway police and similar.
Yeah, that's right, road policing.
Yeah. And then we've got this interesting one, lost output, 4.6 billion. That's an interesting one to break down a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, so that's if you're injured and you have to take time off work, or you're in hospital and you're not able to work, what's your loss? What's the loss of your contribution to the economy while you're being paid sick leave? Yeah,
and then we're getting a bit larger, 6.1 billion, which is insurance and damage to property. So insurance, I suppose that kind of says what it does on the tin, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean that's damage to the vehicles and damage caused by the vehicles.
Yeah, and then we've got this huge lump, which is human costs, 22.8 billion a year, and this covers a few bits and pieces. But actually, this is broadly to do with fatalities and injuries, right? This is
It is, yeah, and there are sort of standardised values of life that we use in this country, but they're derived in a reasonably systematic way from surveying people what value they attach to having a limb rather than not having a limb, or having a relative alive rather than not having them alive. So it's a subjective cost, but it's standardised and reasonably robust, and it varies somewhat between country to country, and certainly a developing country will tend to have very different values of life to a developed country. But certainly amongst the developed countries, the figures tend to be similar. It's in the order of £1 to £2 million per life.
So it's an interesting one. So we were chatting a little bit about this before we went live, and so I use these values a lot in engineering actually, because when I use them as part of risk assessments. The common safety method on the railways, when we're doing what's called an explicit CSM risk assessment, we have to use these values. And I thought they'd come straight from insurance companies, but actually it sounds like there's not an unreasonable, well, as you say, it's actually quite a good methodology behind it to generate them. So yeah, it's 1.898 million for life, and then the breakdown, certainly on the railways, that's a fatality, and then a tenth of that is associated with a serious injury, and then it kind of breaks down in that way, and it includes mental health as well, sort of long-term psychological impacts within that. So yeah, so we use those. So essentially that number, that 22.8 billion, is derived from looking at fatalities, serious injuries, long-term minor injury, that breakdown, and then associating a cost with each of those to give this number. Which is actually quite a good way to to record that and make comparisons across different modes. As you'd imagine, sorry, go on.
When I say, although it's not a cost that involves transfer of money, it is something that people value, even if people wouldn't automatically try to attach a monetary value to somebody's life or their own well-being. There is a real value to it, and so and this is one of the big challenges in economics generally: is how do you quantify things which you don't pay money for? Absolutely. But nevertheless, it is a very real cost. And when people sort of say that, speeding is a victimless crime, well, it is until you hit somebody and you injure them or you kill them, and then there's a huge cost to the family that's involved, and it's hard for people to keep that in mind when they're thinking about the cost of roads. Absolutely,
yeah. And at some point, I might do a discussion about. I might have a chat about that topic in and of itself, because it's quite interesting to see how engineers use those values to prioritise different engineering proposals. Actually, so there's maybe an interesting discussion to have there at some point. But anyway, back to this presentation. So those numbers. So let's look at how those two compare to each other, I think, because there are some other externalities that we're going to touch on. But first, those are the things that we can fairly easily, relatively easily quantify. So we have the total for motoring income. So that's the amount coming into government's coffers, 43.8 billion. The amount of outgoings that we've looked at so far is 45.7 billion. So already, I think anyone who's reasonable at maths and adding can see that government's losing 2 billion a year-ish already, and that's before you start considering some of these externalities.
Just to be clear on it, it's not government losing it, it's society.
Society is losing it, yeah, you're right, sorry. Society is already at a loss, but that's excluding externalities like the health costs of pollution, health costs of physical inactivity, the environmental costs of GHG emissions, and the ecological costs of the existence of roads, expansion of roads, of traffic and pollution. I suppose within health costs you've got things like stress and anxiety as well. Noise is something that actually is really not good for people's mental health in busy cities, impacting on sleep. All these things. I think you had some numbers for or some broad numbers for the GHG emissions one, I think, didn't you?
So it's very difficult. It's very hot research what the cost of carbon, what the carbon cost should be. So at the moment we have a European carbon trading scheme, and that attaches a price of about £30 a tonne. And the UK has a carbon floor, which I originally used to think was a floor. In other words, it was a number that it wouldn't go below. Actually, it's a supplement. So actually in the UK, it's about another roughly £30 a tonne. So actually in the UK, we pay considerably more per tonne for those emissions which are traded. So electricity generation does involve purchase of carbon credits. And that's actually one of the reasons, probably one of the main reasons, in fact, why the UK has managed to almost squeeze coal out of the grid, because of that additional carbon cost. But it's had all sorts of, because we're connected to the rest of Europe, we've got interconnectors to the Netherlands and to France. It's actually had some interesting effects on prices of electricity in the rest of the continent, because we import and export depending on price differentials between the two. At the lower end, if you take if you just took £50 a tonne, which is kind of what the price is roughly at the moment, and the total carbon emissions from transport, or greenhouse gas emissions, so carbon equivalent, It's 118 megatons at the moment per year. So that would be equivalent to 5.9 billion pounds. But there's very good research to look at what price you need in order to get the changes in energy generation that are necessary. For instance, to make BECCS, biofuels and carbon capture, and to make that viable, you need a price of about $240 a ton. So that's 182 pounds a ton. So that would be a price of 21.5 billion pounds just for carbon.
Just for carbon emissions, yeah.
Just for the UK carbon emissions of transport.
Yeah, good.
And actually, the interesting thing in pollution, something that we're only really just beginning to get a grip on, because it's very new research, is the microplastics of tyre wear. So when you get your tyres replaced, I mean, it's because they've gone bald. Well, where's all that rubber, plastic, in fact, where's it gone? Well, actually, what's happened is it's got ground up into tiny microparticles, and it's basically got flushed down the drains, and most of it's ended up going out into the riverways and into the sea. So a large contribution to microplastics in the environment are from vehicle tyres.
Yeah. If anyone watches Formula One, I'm sure you've all seen the little rubber, all the mess of rubber that collects on the side of the track. Well, that's intense because they're soft rubber tyres designed to do that, but there are only 20 cars. So just imagine our main roads, and the bits are a bit smaller, but just all that rubber, think how quickly it takes you to go through the rubber on your tyres, and there are millions of vehicles on the road. It's a hell of a lot of rubber just being shed into the, not to mention all the other kind of nasties that are getting washed off cars, rust and goodness knows all, heavy metals and all sorts. Because it's not just rubber in tyres as well. There are other nasties in amongst it that get washed out. Yeah, so those externalities aren't included in that previous sort of sum. So you can see that actually once you start looking at the cost, so that's what we could easily quantify. Once you start looking at these costs as well, the cost to society of driving is of road traffic generally is enormous, absolutely enormous, and unaccounted for.
Yeah.
So then, kind of moving parallel to that, we've got this idea of sunk versus marginal cost. Now, before we go into these slides, tell us a bit about why this is important for this discussion about road pricing.
So this is the other reason why we need road pricing. It's about the behaviour change. And when you're making an economic decision, and lots of decisions are in fact economic, there's a concept of sunk costs and marginal costs. And sunk costs are things that you've already committed to. So you've bought your car. It's now sitting on the road. It's whether you use it or not, that's a cost you've incurred. Yeah. And similarly, the annual insurance on the car, that's a cost you've incurred, whether or not you drive. It's a legal requirement. And then there's the marginal costs, which are the cost you incur to actually use the car. So they're kind of the per mile, per kilometre cost. And we're very sensitive to marginal costs and relatively insensitive to sunk costs. We just kind of think, the sunk cost is just something you're obliged to do. People spend much less, effort on trying to reduce their sunk costs relative to marginal costs. And one of the things that you'll have noticed in the last decade or two, there's been a very big shift towards subscription pricing of things like mobile phones and Sky subscriptions and all those things, because it's a sort of you kind of make the commitment once. You don't have to. You don't pay as you go. So you're not thinking every time you watch a movie or every time you watch a football match, that's going to cost me. Do I really want to spend that money today to do that? You pay it all up front, and then it's kind of all you can eat from then.
Yeah. And it's the same with credit. It's why credit cards were kind of a big deal when they first came out, because it helped shift. It helped detach us, and it turned our regular expenditure into looking a bit more like, it was an easy way to play with the psychology of expenditure, which is something that these subscription models play on. So let's have it. So you gave me some numbers, which, well, not numbers actually, just a bit of a good breakdown, which I think is quite useful for people. And I'm sure everyone on the feed, everyone watching this, I'm sure these kind of make sense, but I think it's interesting seeing them broken down. So for driving, you've got your sunk costs, so like vehicle purchase, maintenance, insurance, as you said, vehicle excise duty, And then parking, actually, if you've got to pay for storing your car when you're not using it at home. And then on top of that, you've then got the marginal costs of fuel, tolls, and then parking whenever you're going. I think it's quite nice to see those broken down. So it's easy to forget. And a lot of the discussions we have of people who moan about train tickets. Okay, train tickets are too expensive in the UK anyway, but we all know that. But you can't compare hopping on a train with the cost of just fuel, because that's not really a sensible way of looking at of comparing the benefits of public transport. And we'll come back to this slide in a minute. But if you look at public transport, it's just marginal costs. It's just the cost of your fare. Any kind of last mile connections, and then parking fees perhaps at the station. So I don't know if you wanted to say anything about this kind of breakdown, Ed.
Well, it's when you people moan about how expensive it is to travel by train, or even to travel by bus, and bus really isn't all that expensive. The comparison is with the marginal cost of driving. People have kind of just sort of forgotten all of the upfront costs that they've incurred in order to have the car and be able to drive it on the road, and they're just looking at, well, it costs me so much in fuel to drive there, and the cost for the car park, but then they're comparing that with the fare to travel on the train or the bus, which is covering the fuel, the labour, the infrastructure supported, the maintenance, the cleaning, the security, everything is it's all lumped in. You're paying for all of that in the fare on a sort of pay as you go basis, and so that we're not comparing like with like, but that's the kind of once you've made the commitment to buy a car, it actually is perfectly rational to compare your marginal cost of driving with the full cost of using public transport. So, and this leads you to one conclusion, which is we have to make car dependency. We have to reduce car dependency. We have to make it as possible for as many people as possible not to have a car. Because if you don't have a car, then actually you can make much more sensible decisions about when you use a car. Because you can use a Zip car or a Hertz hire car when you really, really need a car. But then you pay for it because that's what you need, rather than taking the bus or going by train or getting on your bicycle.
Absolutely,
So we kind of need to, we've got to try and remove the need to have a car in the first place. But where you have to have a car, one of the things that we want to do, and this is why we're talking about road pricing, is we need to shift some of these sunk costs into marginal costs. So actually they become part of what we use when we're making that decision whether to use the public transport or use the car.
So it's that, very much that behavioural element is the moving. So things like your vehicle exercise duty that you've got there in the sunk costs, and shifting it over into the market. Yeah, okay. So I can see how it just helps support the idea that actually you're thinking about more whenever you are about to pick up the keys from the kind of your cupboard or wherever it is. Think, actually, do I need to make this journey? And then more crucially, which is sort of the utopia that we all imagine, which is actually that the majority of us don't own a car and we use hire cars and sort of top-up cars or city car or whatever it happens to be more frequently. I never understood why hire cars haven't kicked off in a bigger way more recently, to be honest, because they're phenomenally useful. And actually, you can hire a car pretty much every weekend, and it's still cheaper than buying a car and maintaining and insuring a car of your own.
I mean, I think the bit that the industry hasn't really cracked is the one-way rental. So if you're going to spend a long weekend with your family, you're paying for a rental car to sit on their driveway for 2-3 days. That's that doesn't really make much sense, and it also means that the car's not available to be used by other people. So it's not efficient. So if in a sense what we really need is just a national hire car network. So there's one company or franchises of one company, and it basically you can drive anywhere, drop the car off, and then pick up another car when you need it. It's the model we need.
Oh, there we go. Nationalise Hertz, everyone. You heard it here first.
Since it's bankrupt, it's
it's true. It's kind of a moot point. Yeah, that's very true. I'll be all for that. So you look at the marginal cost of public transport, and as you say, there's not really a huge amount. I don't know if you've got anything else to add on that, really, but it's people seem to have these quite vividly in their mind. Taxi fares and station parking fees, and of course the actual fare of the core public transport as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is one thing that's worth saying, which is that the media, which is mostly, most of the people who write in the media are car owners who are fairly anti-public transport. They always pick the most expensive single fare as the comparator. And the reality is that anyone who does use public transport very, very rarely has to pay, the rock up on the day peak fare. But actually, in the UK, because of the way that because it's privatised, we've incentivised companies to basically price gouge. In other words, you sell the ticket for the highest price that someone's prepared to pay for it. And so, but the corollary of that is it means that they're also able to sell tickets at ridiculously cheap prices. So you can get tickets which are ludicrously cheap, to go from London to Edinburgh, if you book them, on the within an hour of being released.
It's a core point that. Sorry, I've interrupted you there, but it's one thing that Britain's railways have. We have the cheapest and the most expensive fares in Europe, because I think Mark off of seat 61, man in seat 61, highlights that Britain has the most commercially competitive rail fare system. Now, for better or worse, I'm not necessarily advocating for that. That can exclude a lot of people, and I'd prefer that the average price was lower. But that's the reason that functions is because we have a saturated network. It's a very full railway network, and so we have the ability. Demand is sufficiently high. Okay, post-COVID, when things steady out again, demand is sufficiently high that fares essentially can be as high as they want to be because the seats are always full.
That's right. We actually use pricing to ration the use of trains, which is which seems perverse. But
it does,
but it's because, as you say, the network is at capacity at peak times on key routes.
So, what does road pricing actually look like? That's the next question. So we talked about sunk versus marginal costs. We've talked about we've addressed perhaps the fiscal and the behavioural reasons for it, but this is kind of covering what it looks like. Very briefly, I'm going to just say I'm drinking Brewdog Hazy Jane, by the way. I don't know if anyone else is enjoying a nice beer this evening, but Are you drinking anything nice, Ed? You got anything pleasant?
It's non-alcoholic, but it's very nice there.
Oh, lovely. So anyway, right, what does road pricing look like? So we've got three widget images here. Everyone knows me. I like to make graphics marginally excessively flashy to the point of comical. So there are three things here. So I'll bring them up one by one, and you can maybe talk us through each one in turn. So first of all, tolls.
So I mean, everyone is familiar with tolls in lots of the big bridges and tunnels in this country were built on the basis that they would be paid for through tolls. And the M6 toll was our sort of one and only experiment in charging for a normal road in that way. Interestingly, the A14 upgrade between roughly Cambridge and Huntingdon, when that was first proposed, that was going to be a toll road with a local access road running parallel to it. But that was rejected out of hand, largely because, unlike the M6 toll, where you have got a motorway alternative, it's kind of you're paying a premium for a shortcut on a motorway when you could just stay on the existing motorway. The A14 there wouldn't have been that. It would have been a local, probably very congested, single carriageway local road alternative. So that is never really taken off in this country. But France, America, it's perfectly normal to pay to pass through a toll at various points along when you join a motorway at various points along it. So that's commonplace. It's less common in cities, but we'll talk a bit more about tolls in cities.
So that's tolls. The next one is, I believe it's cordons. Yes, cordons, which I've not heard this word as the umbrella term actually for kind of congestion charging systems, right?
Yeah, I mean it's sort of exclusively cities that would use a cordon charge, and London is one of it's the one we know best, but it's not actually the most common type of charge. But essentially, the cordon means that you pay the charge to drive within an area bounded by a border. So when you cross the border into the city, you then are you're then required to pay the fare. Now, you might think, oh well, if you just drive within the city, then you wouldn't have to pay it. But actually, although the cameras are all mounted on the points where you cross the boundary, there are also mobile cameras to pick up the local traffic that's not crossing the cordons, or that might have been missed by the cameras coming in.
Yeah. So one of the things I've talked about a fair amount is that I believe that, and maybe our discussion might change my mind on this. For me, I see ultra low emission zones as being a really important rapid fire step for us to quickly start reducing traffic within cities, even within larger towns and built up areas. So I always felt like it's a quick way for us to start modifying behaviour within urban areas. But yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, it hasn't proven to be quick. So the introduction of ultra low emission zones, other than in London, where the governance is there to make it happen reasonably quickly. Other cities that have been sitting on it. I mean, Leeds has been playing around with intending to introduce it. Manchester, Birmingham, and then COVID came along, and basically all those plans were put on hold.
Yeah.
And the thing is that actually, the incentive to switch commercial vehicles to electric is now very high, because electricity is cheap, and although petrol and diesel are somewhat cheaper now because of lower demand, once they go back up to pre-COVID prices, most commercial companies will be looking to replace their vehicles with ultra low emission vehicles anyway, as part of their replacement cycle. So actually, by the time these ultra low emission vehicle zones to kick in, once they bite, the proportion of traffic that's going to be caught by them is not going to be that great. So they're not going to be big revenue raisers, and they're probably not going to do. I mean, had we introduced them 5 years ago, they would have been brilliant. I think the reality is if we're introducing them only over the next 5 years, their impact is going to be relatively small. Yes. And actually, one of the things that we haven't really managed to thrash out is, do we make bus companies pay as well? They're providing a public transport service, but they use buses that emit diesels. Now, actually, Euro 6 buses are remarkably low emission vehicles. A Euro 6 bus emits less in absolute terms than a Euro 6 car. And there are different standards for cars. But actually, they are. It is so good. The system that's installed in a bus, that actually the emissions are really are lower than a car.
Amazing, yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. That's usefully insightful. I suppose it's interesting thinking about the incentive for electric vans. So for me, we had a chat with Nicole Badstuber about inner city logistics, actually, and I think that's going to be a really good future rail matter, actually. But I've been pleased to see some companies starting to pick up the baton. Okay, it's obviously slower than any of us would like, but in York, DPD, fair play to them, have a fleet of electric vans. Now, they're decent-sized vans. It's like a kind of a decent. It's not quite transit, but it's a bit smaller than that. But for me, that's exactly what I'd be hoping to see, is those sorts of vans doing the logistics within built-up areas, because they're 100%. Batteries aren't perfect, but it's certainly cleaner than what's there before. Anyway, right, okay. So this is the last bubble here is distance-based.
And this is kind of the future of the holy grail, because until you've got distance-based, you haven't really got road pricing. If all we're going to be doing is setting up toll booths or gantries at various points, not only is that hugely expensive, but it also greatly limits where you can realistically do it. But if you can do a distance-based thing where you're effectively GPS tracking vehicles, and then you can charge by the time of day, by the road that they're using, what type of vehicle it is, then you've got the ability to have a truly discriminatory road pricing system. And there's one country which we'll come to, which is introducing this. And they will be the pioneer from which we will all learn.
Yep, absolutely. Right, so let's have a look. Let's kind of break some of these down. So I think, yeah, so you've got some examples, I think, here. So
yeah, so little known, but there is a congestion. Well, it's actually not congestion charge. It's just a charging zone in Durham. It's the only one outside of London, and it was introduced simply to reduce traffic trying to access the city centre. So if you want to drive right into the middle of the centre, you have to pay a £2 charge to that, and that's obviously on top of any parking fees you'd have to pay.
Yeah. Which is a no-brainer. It's interesting, actually. I forgot to mention earlier. You were talking about how tough it is politically to introduce congestion charges. I remember when Edinburgh did a referendum on introducing one, because I was either in Edinburgh at the time or was soon to become move back to Edinburgh to become a student. And I remember I was like, why has everyone decided that? But the reality is that it's not. It's a difficult sell, and it's better to build consensus. And then a referendum certainly isn't the way to go, to be honest. But it just shows how difficult a sell it is if it's not sold to the public in the right way, if it's not explained and it's not part of a bigger picture and explaining what the benefits are.
Well, it's that, and it's also that you kind of need to give people. People tend to talk about carrots and sticks. I hate that term. I tend to talk about options and incentives. But if you're going to create a negative incentive by charging people more to drive, then what are the options you're going to give them instead? And most cities, the options are inadequate. The buses don't run where people need them to go at the hours they need, the frequency, and so on. So people want to believe. Well, not to believe. They want to see the public transport alternatives, the cycling infrastructure that's there ready for them to use when the congestion charge comes in. But the reality is that we don't have the space and the money to sort of do that. The local authorities need the revenue from congestion charging in order to invest in buses, and they don't have the money to sort of do it up front, if you like. So that has been a big problem. The one city that did have a referendum and they managed to get it passed. It was Stockholm, and that was because they did a trial. So they did the congestion charge as a 1-year trial, and people were deeply opposed to it before it came in, but because it was a trial, it was
it seems like okay, well, fine, yeah.
And then the trial went in, and people thought, oh, actually, I can adapt to this. And by the time it came to the end of the trial, when the trial ended, they did stop it. It wasn't they didn't play around with it. Well, they didn't sort of pretend to do a trial. They did actually do a trial. They did a referendum, and it passed. But the referendum. The other issue is who do you count in the referendum? Because if you just take a referendum, people live in the city boundary, then they're the ones who see the benefits. They see the less traffic, they get the better public transport, the quieter streets, and all the rest of it. What about the people who live in the suburbs and the people who live in the villages outside? Are they going to be as supportive? And that's again one of the problems of getting consensus.
So Andrew S in the chat. It's the first time we've got some interesting queries. Do send your questions, everyone. There's all sorts of good natter going on, but it's fairly sideways. Andrew asks if there's data on this Durham one and whether it worked. Do you have any idea of what the effectiveness of this scheme has been?
I don't know that there's been a formal study of it, but it's effective in the sense that, as far as I know, they don't have a problem with congestion or too many people trying to drive into the city centre. In other words, it's kind of self-regulating. It's kind of an equilibrium point. So yes, I think it does work, but it's a very, very small scheme. I mean, it's almost just like a cul-de-sac. It's almost like a parking fee, really. It's not really a congestion charge. But
I would. I suppose this comes to what we're about to talk about, but I suppose in my mind I was imagining systems like this, these little charging zones, popping up in all sorts of towns around as an incentive, well, if nothing else, to reduce HGVs accessing these areas. Okay, so the next slide, so that's the Durham charging zone, which is... I think
it's two. I don't know if it's still £2, but it's £2 to go. That's what you pay to. I think that gives you multiple entries as well. But it's not expensive, certainly compared to the London one.
Jen on the Move raises a good point, which is: are congestion charging zones or these sorts of zones, do they risk being regressive because they can penalise The people who are less well off, lower income earners. Obviously, £2 for someone who's very low income is significant, and someone on a higher income bracket not so much.
Well, this is true, but it's such a knotty debate, this. But the argument would be that by charging the £2, then people who, delivery drivers, disabled people, disabled people probably get an exemption anyway. But people who need to drive can drive, and they don't, and there aren't so many people driving that the buses get held up. So if you're really poor, you can't afford a car anyway. So you are totally reliant on either buses or cycling or walking. So if the congestion charge has the effect of reducing the congestion, so the buses can run more reliably, and the company can afford to run more buses for the same operating cost, then there's a benefit there to the people, to poorer people.
Absolutely.
So it's you can always cite somebody who needs to use a car who is poor, who will be disadvantaged, and politicians are always saying, "Oh, well, we'll give you an exemption." But actually, you can't give exemptions. There isn't going to be a perfect system. We kind of have to get to a point where nobody needs a car because the public and active transport alternatives are just fantastic. And anybody who needs a car because of disability is exempted, and they don't experience any congestion, and so that's the kind of nirvana that we're trying to get to.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a point I raise actually a lot. Is people talk. Is actually the statistics broadly in car ownership show that London has some very good statistics on car ownership, and car ownership is very much actually the domain of middle and higher income bracket people, actually.
Yeah.
So yes, as you say, there are people who are less well off, and actually regionally that changes because London does have a viable PT and active travel set of alternatives. Regionally, it's a bit different, but we should be aiming for the place where people are able to rely on public transport. I
think actually in the whole of England, I can't remember the exact figure now, but it's about 50% of the people in the lowest quintile. So in other words, the poorest 20% of the population, about 50% of them do not have access to a car.
Yeah, so it's important to look at that, and that isn't. Yeah, those sorts of statistics are really important to have to hand in those sorts of discussions, which happen fairly frequently. Right, we will press on because we're already nearly at 8 o'clock. I hope you don't mind. We might push a little bit late. Is that a problem for you, Ed? Are you all right?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
So this is probably the most well-known one in the UK, right? London congestion charging. Here's the central zone. I put an extra picture up actually. So we've got the kind of the standard C sign picture, but also there's the picture you put up, which is of this. It's not a transit van, it's a Mercedes, slightly shifty-looking van with a CCTV camera on top. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and that's the mobile camera. So London is actually quite unusual that the cameras that you pass by are quite discreet. They're black and they're just on poles mounted at the side of the road. Most cities that have congestion charges, they have gantries, and we'll see a picture of one of those. But in order to catch people who are either just driving within the city centre itself, so local traffic, or who somehow manage to miss, or the number plate reader doesn't catch them, these vans will catch some of those. So it just means you can't evade it. It's a bit like the TV detector van.
Yeah. Oh, crikey. Yeah, it's an interesting one. So that's the London congestion charge. So, and I suppose the ULEZ is different, right? Is the ULEZ a natural step beyond the congestion charge, or is it actually a very different system laid on top of it? I don't necessarily know exactly the difference between the two.
They're essentially the same sort of system. So there's ANPR cameras to monitor the vehicles passing through, but because ULEZ is only certain classes of vehicles that are required to pay, it's much easier for them to enforce. There's been a lot of debate, for instance, in Birmingham and other cities about whether private cars should be included or not. So the congestion charge in London is all vehicles. Even the discount that there's a 90% discount for people who live within the zone, but that's been suspended since the changes for COVID. But ULEZ has a relatively small proportion of vehicles get caught by that. But it is essentially the same system.
Yeah. And then the next image is we've moved beyond our shores into where is this? Göteborg.
So this is Stockholm.
This is Stockholm.
Yeah. So the more typical form of urban road charging is to put up gantries and just put loads and loads of cameras on them. And the idea is to have the cameras lined up with the lanes, and that you get a high reliability when vehicles are travelling at high speed. They're not going to be blocked, obscured by a vehicle in front and so on. I don't know what the sort of hit rate is in London, because having all the cameras mounted on poles at the side of the road, and the roads aren't so wide, they probably do miss some vehicles.
Yeah. So this is a cordon. So it's a cordon system right around the city.
This one isn't a cordon system, actually. This is really this is a type of toll system.
Right.
So that there are gantries set up now. Although most of the gantries are set at the point where you, the most obvious ones are where you're leaving the main road to enter an urban road to go into the city. There are actually gantries set up. I'm fairly sure about this. There are gantries set up at various points within the city as well.
Okay. Yeah. It's a funny one. It's such a normal thing when you're driving around Europe to go through a toll road. This is a slight segue, but so what I'm in Serbia to see the family, and they're the only motorway they have through Serbia. It's a toll road. You queue up and pay your toll as you go through, and it's so strange that in the UK we don't, that never particularly. Yeah, it's interesting.
So in Sweden you pay a certain amount at each gantry that you pass through, and it's capped at a daily amount of 105 Swedish kronas, which is about £9.15.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I mean, Sweden, things do cost a little bit more, I suppose, relatively.
Yeah, but then the London one is £15 a day.
Yeah, that's true. So, I'm lucky in York in that I just we drive and buy the heaviest, loudest, noisiest, most claggy vehicle and just drive it straight through the city centre without any problem. So be glad to know I don't do that. Right, the next image. Okay, so this is interesting. So where's this then? Tell us. This is your photograph, actually, by the look of it. From back in
it is, yes. So in 2018, I visited Singapore and had a look at the what they call the electronic road pricing ERP network that they have there, and this is gantries that are dotted all around the city, and you pay a certain amount to pass under each one of them. So you accumulate a toll through the day, and there's no daily cap either. And the amount that each toll is set at varies by time of day, and by the road. So it varies between 50 half a Swedish dollar, a Singaporean dollar, and $6, which is about 28 pence, and £3.35. So that £3.35 is to pass one gantry at the peak time on the busiest roads. Now they set the prices to maintain a traffic flow of 20 to 30 kilometres an hour on arterial roads and 45 to 65 kilometres an hour on expressways, and they redo the pricing periodically in order to get this sort of optimal road speed.
Mm. So does this tie in then with the next image, this one?
Yeah. So each of those blue rectangles is a gantry, and each one of them has its own pricing formula, and that will vary by time of day. And so the really busy roads will be very expensive, and the smaller roads will maybe less. But the ones right in the central business district will be the most expensive. So this counts.
So this still actually counts. I suppose is it a bit of a hybrid? Is it actually kind of a bit of a tolls and cordon sort of hybrid?
Well, it's a toll. It's a very complex network of tolls. So it's not a cordon.
Oh,
really.
okay. So it is a pure toll system. It's just it's a fiddly one. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's essentially. Singapore is more than just the city, but it is essentially covers the whole island.
Yeah.
And it's So it's a very dense toll network. But interestingly, it's very debatable about whether it by itself is adequate to control congestion. In order to own a car, you have to have what's called a certificate of entitlement, and those are rationed. In fact, as of last year, I think, the government stopped issuing them. So there is a finite number of certificates of entitlement out there in the and you have to bid for one if you want to own a car, and they go up to £20,000. So you have to pay £20,000 in order to have the right to then go and buy a car, and that's valid for 10 years in the first place. And then once you get to 10 years, you have a choice about whether you buy another one, after 17 years, you've got to get rid of the car completely. You're not allowed to drive.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Sold on that. It's got to be exported from the country, or it's got to be scrapped.
Ah, crikey.
So there's a big export market, actually. It's based on New Zealand and Australia.
Ah, right. Okay. Crikey. So, and is that then augmented? Presumably, that isn't necessarily hugely horrendous for less well-off people, because there is an effective public transport system across Singapore, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is a stunning public transport system, and actually they're now investing very heavily in developing a cycle network. And when I was there were loads and loads of hire bikes, littered all over the place. That wasn't a particularly successful experiment, but they're building the infrastructure to support cycling, which is interesting given it's a tropical country, and that in the middle of summer it is hideously hot and probably not conducive at all to cycling. But the public transport network is superb. The bus services are superb. The underground network, of which they're still expanding, is superb and reasonably priced. So the percentage of trips made by public transport is very high. I think it's over 75%. So I think last about 76% of trips are made on public transport.
And that's absolutely incredible. I've never been to Singapore, actually. I mean, occasionally I thought, should I go out for the F1? But yeah, it's a very long way away, and I think maybe it's one for the long term. I think the only way I'll get there anytime soon is if I end up doing some work out there. But the trouble is, they've finished lots of their public transport system. They're kind of decades ahead of everywhere else. Anyway, right. So we're already at 8:10. Let's have a look at road pricing and what that might look like in the UK. Well, firstly, I suppose the question is, while this big orange slide is up, is so none of those systems were road pricing systems. They were all tolls and cordons.
Yeah, so the true road pricing system is going to be introduced in Singapore as of possibly this year. I mean, it may slip now, and that is going to be GPS and cell phone tracked. So every car has to be fitted with a thing that can talk to the gantries to track you and make sure that you're paying your toll. And that's going to be replaced by a more sophisticated device that's going to be a GPS sensor, and that is going to do a similar job, but is going to be measuring the distance you travel and what time you travel, and is going to calculate your charge and display, like a taxi meter in your car is going to show you precisely what charges you're incurring as you're incurring.
Okay, that's quite nice. Yeah. And so to what extent? So yeah, that's similar to the insurance black boxes that are, or not necessarily, but it's not a dissimilar technology to the insurance black boxes in place now. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So that's sort of the system. I suppose we could talk for hours about the various intricacies of that system, and perhaps how it would be operated, who would operate it, if you'd have if the DVLA would be, or which body. There's all sorts of discussion there, but actually that's probably not that. It would go around in circles basically. Whereas what I think is interesting, and you sent this data through, and I'm really glad you did, because it's really interesting to look at it, is actually some actual numbers of what road pricing could materially look like in the UK. So there are two slides with numbers on them that we have. The first one is actually just, I presume, stats now that exist now that are for the way that we drive vehicles around now in the UK.
Yeah, so these are the latest published stats on the number of registered vehicles. This is in Great Britain.
It's GB, okay, not Northern Ireland. Yeah.
For odd statistical anomaly, they don't collect all the same stats for Northern Ireland as well. So these are to be fully comparable. They're all GB. So this is the number of vehicles licensed in each different of these category, and the total logged distance that they're driven. And therefore, you can calculate what the average driven per vehicle in each class is, and you can see how heavy goods vehicles do big mileages, because they're commercial vehicles. They don't sit around idle.
So we've got 39 million vehicles registered ish, covering 530 billion kilometers annually. That's some mileage right there. And yeah, so the average distance driven is, so for cars and taxis around about 13,000 kilometers a year. Yeah, that makes it. So it's about, what's that, 8,000 miles? That kind of figures around, doesn't it? Crikey, that's some mileage. So then the way this manifests itself is that then you can sort of do your number scrunching, and then okay. So there are two columns here that are the interesting ones that you can talk about. So there's a factor column, and then the user cost. Okay, it's fairly self-evident what that one means, but those two columns are then what give us our revenues and average kind of annual user costs. So yeah, the first two columns. Explain those two then. The factor first. What does that mean?
So the factor is just a very crude attempt to attribute some proportionality, if you like, to the cost. So clearly, a heavy goods vehicle causes much more damage and more pollution and so on than a car. So therefore, it should pay more per mile. But actually, we would actually want to see something much more sophisticated than this. But this is just to start us out. So goods vehicles actually in this case covers everything from large vans to 6-axle HGVs. So I've just assumed that we've got an average factor of 5 in there, with the HGVs probably being a factor more like 10 and the medium-sized goods vehicles being at the lower end. And buses and coaches, I've kind of assumed that because buses provide a public service, we don't want to increase the marginal cost there. We don't want to add more cost to the fares. So buses would be free, but private coaches would pay. So I've just taken a very low factor just to account for the private coaches. And motorcycles, well, they take up a bit of space, they cause some pollution, they cause noise. So let's just assume that they have a factor of 0.2 relative to a private car. Now, the price figures, and I've deliberately chosen a figure that gives me the right answer. So,
which is what would happen anyway, right? Government would balance these numbers to broadly bring them the income that they're looking for. So it's not an unrealistic thing for you to do.
Exactly. So all I've aimed to do here is just to replace the income to the Treasury. So in other words, that fuel duty, the VAT, and the money that we are paying now in one way or another through vehicle accident duty and so on, that how if those were to be replaced by a per mile, per kilometre fee, this is what the total sum needs to be, and so the 6.5 pence per mile, per kilometre for a car, and then using the other factors. Using the factors to arrive at the other figures, and then multiplying by the distances currently driven by vehicles in each of those classes, that's how we get the 43.7 billion pounds per year. And this assumes, of course, that they wouldn't change behaviour, and we would actually hope that it would change behaviour, that it would reduce driving. So therefore, if Treasury was really needed to, actually wanted to get like-for-like replacement of its tax revenue, the figure would almost certainly have to be higher in order to kind of overshoot, and then there would be some... And then
manage that rebalancing, yeah.
That's right.
As it would hopefully drive some modal shift, yeah, absolutely.
That's exactly. And not just modal shift, but actually people just not making journeys because they don't need to, or that they can figure out other ways of doing it, or more efficient ways of trip chaining, or doing more online ordering, or whatever, that sort of thing. Yeah. So all sorts of changes.
So sorry, go on, yeah.
So the average cost is what the annual cost for an average vehicle in each class would pay. So the average person, car owner, would find themselves paying £817 a year. And that might sound a lot, but that's replacing all of the kind of invisible costs of paying fuel duty and VAT and the VED. So that's probably not, it should, for the average person, that should actually be pretty much what they pay now.
Yeah. So there are some interesting discussions going on in the chat, actually, that I think are worth raising. So there's some discussions of using ANPR. I suppose that then becomes toll rather than kind of, it's... So I suppose the more wide discussion is about people are worried about those who bypass GPS on the vehicle. Others are worried about having GPS trackers on the car. They feel uncomfortable about that. There's some other discussions about could people, people bypass tachometers now? Could they bypass GPS? Some interesting discussions about that. And why does it have to be? As someone else asked, in fact, I see who specifically asked it, 'cause it's an interesting question. Muser Zero asks, why would it need to be GPS based? Can it not just be mileage based? So that's
Well, so I think in the first place, to get political buy-in for this, it has to actually be a like-for-like replacement for what's there now. As soon as the papers can identify individuals who are going to end up paying 2 or 3 times what they pay now to drive, it'll be a non-starter. Just the road lobby is too strong. So I think in the first place, the most obvious thing to do actually is just a simple mileage-based fee that is proportionate to some degree to the impact of the vehicle, so the weight of the vehicle and the emissions and all the rest of the vehicle. So you get a little bit of subtle, something a bit more subtle than fuel duty. I mean, fuel duty is proportionate to the weight of the vehicle and to some, to the mileage you do. We could be a little bit more subtle than that with road pricing, but essentially, yes, we could just simply do it that you report how far you drive periodically.
Say when you get your MOT, I suppose it could
exactly.
You pick up the mileage then.
And that could be done through the garage could do that, and they do it now. They log your mileage and it gets fed into DVLA. That data could be used to charge people, and maybe like with self-assessment with tax, you would sort of pay in advance for the next year based on your previous consumption, so that and then it'd be balanced out at the end of the year, and that way you're not just paying a massive lump sum at the end of the year. It's spread out. So there are ways to do it, and then the privacy issue about once you start getting into having tracking. I think it's very important that the data doesn't go directly to government. I mean, mileage isn't very sensitive, it's not a personally sensitive piece of information. But as soon as you've got, more sensitive than that, so you've got the time of day that they're travelling, on what roads they're travelling, and so on. You don't want that data going into a big government database. So to my mind, the most obvious intermediaries for this are insurers. You have a relationship with an insurer already. It's in both parties' interests to have that data, because they can use it to give you a fairer assessment of your insurance premium, and particularly if you're a young driver, for instance, you have a choice now of you pay an eye-watering amount for insurance, or you have a black box installed that monitors your driving performance, and as long as you drive sensibly, then your premium is going to be affordable. So the same kind of incentive exists for this.
There's some people pointing out that they reckon that that doing it at MOT is one way to resolve privacy issues and also fitting to all vehicles as well. So there's a potential benefit on that side. But do you see there's still a benefit? Yeah. So there are still benefits of it going to GPS tracking rather than mileage
Well, the advantage of GPS tracking is that then you can vary the charge by the road that you're travelling on, the time of day that you're travelling. And this is really important to address one of the equity issues, because at the moment, if you live in a rural area, you of necessity have to drive further than if you live in a city. So you kind of you just don't have the alternative options. So if you just charge a flat rate per mile, then the people who are causing unnecessary congestion by using their car to drive in from the inner suburb to the city centre pay the same per mile, and actually much less annually than somebody who lives in a remote rural area and needs to drive every day to get their kids to school and go to work and so on. So you can have a much lower rate where the impact is lower and the need is higher, and you can only do that if you know where the car is on the road and what time of day.
Yeah, so the kind of the key conclusions of the interesting columns of this. Obviously, the big number is the revenue number there, but I suppose that depends on the user cost, and so you can flex that a bit to change that number. But what is interesting is looking at that pounds per year. So for all of us who own a car, about £800 a year in this example, isn't actually, yeah, if that was coming off fuel duty and VED was absorbed by that, that isn't necessarily a bank breaker. You know, seems like a lot of money on the face of it, but actually, if you consider that there's a good chunk of our fuel price that is accounted for in tax revenue, yeah, it's not crippling.
No, I mean it should be revenue neutral, because essentially what we pay now through fuel duty and all those other things would instead be paid this way.
Yeah.
So it would certainly for the average person with an average car, there should be no difference to how much they pay.
Yeah. So I like the other thing about the GPS trackers is that with sufficient anonymizing and sort of scabbling of the data, that becomes an incredibly powerful and useful data set for the DFT to maybe get its act together and start thinking about transport strategy and where they can be matching or annulling road usage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the knowledge we have about the road network is very poor. I mean, there are counters, automated counters at various points on the motorways and the dual carriageways and some of the big A roads. And local authorities have some counters, but mostly they do manual counts at a few points. The data is hopeless. It's out of date. It's variable because it's contingent on all sorts of things, and actually it's not very reliable. So as you say, if DFT had this feed of anonymized data, aggregated data, real time, it would completely transform our understanding and our ability to model interventions in the road network and potentials for mode shift and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, for me, as someone who's looking at behind the scenes, I'm trying to look at a data-driven way of developing how our rail network specifically needs to look over the next 30 years. It's very difficult to get hold of useful mass data without paying Google, so and so many billion quid for GPS, for mobile phone traces, which you can do, but not as an individual, and so it's not very open. Whereas if that GPS data was sufficiently anonymized and aggregated as open data, it'd be incredibly powerful. And I see no reason for that not to be open data. For the current government, they could say, well, it's great because it means that there's a commercial incentive there. There's some data that the private bus companies could use to improve their service. Then me with my slightly more socialist hat on goes, yeah, but it allows Network Rail and the system operator to understand where they can build a new double-track railway usefully, or these sorts of things. So that's just an incredibly valuable data set. So that's part of the reason why I get excited at that being the way to go with it, rather than just looking at mileage. Right, it's good grief, it's 2023. I'm so sorry, Ed. So the two numbers that are interesting is so current tax revenue being 23.8 billion, and then this road pricing revenue model that you've taken pretty much matches it. So it didn't take you a huge amount of effort to have a reasonably sensibly balanced. And a couple of people have pointed out that private cars and taxis should be priced differently because taxis potentially enable a more efficient use of vehicles. Yeah, I suppose that's true, but I suppose that's just because of the simplicity of your sums in this example.
Well, it is because they're not broken out, but actually taxis are less efficient than most private cars. The occupancy rate of a private car is typically around 1.2, and taxis. I'm not sure what the occupancy rate is, but you can't count the driver. So and there's a loss of dead mileage with taxis. So taxis are they're travelling to the next pickup from the last drop off. So taxis are really not an efficient way.
That's very interesting. Okay, yeah.
I mean, if we had shared taxis and we have sort of kind of demand responsive networks where you can call a vehicle and it automatically plan a route that efficiently picks people up and drops people off with a appropriate sized vehicle, then yes, that becomes efficient. But we don't have that, despite what Uber and Lyft said. That hasn't been the big growth model in their business. Their bread and butter is people just booking an Uber and a Lyft for a traditional A to B by yourself.
Interesting. Okay. Detour points out that actually the mobile phone data isn't perfect, having used it, and actually when you get to busy areas, it's a bit of a mess. and lots of complexities. And yeah, again, that just builds the idea that this GPS data. Okay, GPS data is also not perfect, but I dare say it's probably easier to aggregate and perhaps easier to tidy up. I don't know, but anyway, that's another discussion perhaps. But I like big data, you see, and I like it. I like big open data as well. And so if it could be an open data set, that would be unbelievably powerful.
Yeah, well, you want data which has a relatively small noise factor, and the problem with all the data we have is there is loads and loads of noise and variability in it. A completely extraneous variability in it that we're not able to filter out. And mobile phone data sounds fantastic when you think of it in the abstract, but actually when you look at the data itself, it is incredibly noisy. And you obviously have no idea what mode of transport the person is on when they're moving. They could be driving at walking pace, or they could be on a bus. You've no idea.
Yeah. So let's go side by side. Ed, that's been brilliant. There's been some really good chat going on. Actually, I'm pleased to say all sorts of detailed conversations going on all sorts of subjects, which is what I love about RailNatter. Or in this case, RoadNatter, but we won't tell anyone. Yeah, that's been brilliant. That's been honestly really, really interesting and a lot of food for thought for a lot of people. Some really interesting stuff going on there. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's good. So it only remains to go through me end bits as oft I do. So where are we? Giel rarely can watch these live because he works. He's in the Netherlands, and he's the chap who does our podcast conversion. So hopefully we've described what's on screen in sufficient way that people who listen to this audio only, this makes some broad sense. We have some blind viewers actually who do go off the audio only. So hopefully I've done a reasonable job of that. As ever, you can pick themes by going in and support me on Patreon. Or throwing things at me via PayPal as well, but Patreon's probably the best way. You are my producers. There are 64 of you now, I think. You are my producers, and so I have to listen to you when you shout at me. Whereas the people who shout at me on Twitter, I don't necessarily have to listen to them. Yeah, so thanks to all them. Next week's RailNatter is going to be, finally, we're going to get round to the engineer's guide to being a good crayonista. So this is essentially, I see a lot of people drawing lines in paint on Google Earth screenshots, but I'm going to tell you how to do that, but better. Essentially, as a permanent way engineer, this is sort of a bit of my job, so a bit of an insight there. So we'll get Google Earth up and we'll start drawing some railway lines, and that should be interesting. What else? What's next? Yes. So this is exciting. I did warn Ed about this. He knew this was going to happen. I did tease that there was going to be some news about the Avanti West Coast Pride train. Well, that news is that the name of the train. Okay, there's a competition going on for people to choose the name of the train, and Charlie, as in Charlotte Monroe, has thought of an absolutely exquisite name for this, and has been speaking to people about it, and lots of us all agree that this is exactly what the name of the train should be, and it has an associated hashtag, which is it's the Progress train. The train should be called Progress. So the updated Pride flag that includes the trans colours and the colours of people of colour. So the extra bit, that's now called it's the Progress update to the Pride flag. It's called Progress. And this train should be called Progress, and it just feels like it represents a huge amount. The new livery and lots of other things that Avanti West Coast are doing. So what everyone has to do is go to avantiwestcoast.co.uk/pride and go in there and choose Progress as the name of the train. I'm going to do a video about this tomorrow, and we're going to bang the drum, and Charlie's already done loads of stuff, I'm sure, about this. There's a video that's gone up. It's very exciting. But everyone who's a Patreon supporter, and indeed everyone watching this RailNatter, please go and vote for Progress to be the name of this train. That's exciting. It's a RailNatter exclusive, I think. Yes. So name it Progress. Yeah. And I will just bring us back to Ed so we can say a final goodbye. Ed, that's been brilliant. I've enjoyed that. Sorry, it's an hour and a half. Oh, crikey. So sorry. I'll let you have your evening back. Everyone, you've been brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us. I only really remains to say cheerio. Cheerio.
Cheers.